Last week I made a video about how the Vikings, or more specifically the Norsemen, discovered Iceland in the 9th century, and in this video I mentioned that when they got to Iceland it's thought, and we are fairly certain at this point, that there were already people there, and these were Irish monks, who they gave a specific name. Now in this video I'd like to look at these Irish monks and what they were doing in Iceland, and first of all I'm going to address the question of why were they in Iceland in the first place. Well, to address this I'm going to have to actually go halfway across the world to the deserts of the Middle East, and this is because of a movement of Christians who called themselves the Desert Fathers, and the idea of the Desert Fathers was to find an area called the Pusitania, and if you're interested actually, this is where the Dutch word for desert, which is woestijn, comes from. And the idea behind this was to do just like Jesus did in the 40 days and 40 nights out in the desert. They thought that the best way to try and find God and Jesus was to go out and to isolate oneself, usually in a harsh and inhospitable area like a desert, and that this was the best path to God. Now there were people in Ireland who were inspired by this, especially in the Celtic Christian church, which had many ideas like this in its beliefs about it. And these Irish monks had one problem, which was that there weren't too many deserts kicking around in Ireland. However, there was another type of inhospitable area that the Irish could make use of, and this was of course the sea, and many Irishmen did go off in their curraghs to find what they called the white martyrdom, which was going off into this inhospitable area in the sea, usually an island, for example Skellig Michael in Ireland, as well as a few others which I will cover, which was very different then again to red martyrdom, which is literally going out and being beaten up by other people. This was also a form of quote-unquote salvation in the Celtic Christian tradition. So back to Iceland. Now we think and are fairly certain that they won't have gone to Iceland in one go, just like the Norsemen. There were definitely monks on the Hebrides and the Faroe Islands at this point, which I will also cover. Now the Irish, it's important to remember in this era, were not only in Ireland but also on the western side of Scotland in the kingdom of Dalriada, and this of course meant that they also had access to the Isles, one of the most important places, probably the most important place for Celtic Christendom, certainly outside of Ireland, was the island of Iona, and obviously Iona is itself an island. This is also why when they come to Northumbria they founded their first monastery and their centre of power at Lindisfarne, which is also an island. So you see that this was important for the Celtic Christians who were coming there. And then it's thought that after discovering essentially the Faroe Islands and colonizing there with these monks or hermits, that they then went from there to Iceland, where they also settled. Now there's a man who's called Dilquit, and he says in one of his books from around the period, I believe it's the 6th or 7th century, that there are holy men wandering around in the north, although we don't know if by the north he means just the north as in the Hebrides, Shetland and Orkney and possibly the Faroe Islands, or if he means the north as in Iceland. We're not sure about how common the knowledge of Iceland was, and it's very possible that the Norsemen who were in Ireland halfway through the 9th century heard about Iceland while they were in Ireland from the Irish, or it might have been more of a thing that only the travelling monks who were seeking this kind of desert father approach to isolate themselves only knew about it. We're not entirely sure. So there are several places in Iceland where we are fairly certain that they will have been. Obviously they were driven out when the Norsemen came, but these are some vestiges that might suggest they were there. Now the first one are the Westman Islands, and these are translated to as being the Westmen Islands, and the Norsemen often called the Irish the Westmen because they were the men in the, at that point, the most westerly area that they had discovered, being Ireland. And this is very interesting actually. On the Westman Islands they find these crosses. They found around 200 in total in several man-made caves in southern Ireland, both on the Westman Islands and also on the mainland in the south, in I believe it's called Seljaland. And these are very interesting because these are thought to be evidence of Irishmen there, of Irish hermits, as similar structures have also been found in the Scottish Isles, which would then have a link between the two there. and also the other one, which is Papay, and Papay means the island of the Papar. And the Papar is actually the name given to these Irish monks. It actually comes from Latin, from Papa, which means father, and they thought that then they called the priests the Papa, as in the father of the congregation, and that's where the name comes from. So we also see that there are various names outside of Iceland. Now obviously in Iceland you have the things like the Westman Islands, which are the Westman Islands, Papay and Papile. In Shetland and Orkney you have things like Papay Mare and Papay Mini, which have different names, although those are the sort of the original Celtic names, as well as another place called Papay and Paple. And in the Faroe Islands you have place names like Paparokur and Vestmenahöven, as well as Papushilsur. All of these kind of names meaning something similar. So Paparokur and again Papushilsur, both with the Papar start, and the Vestmenahöven, these are that means the harbour of the Westmen, which again suggests that they were obviously got there through maritime means, and that they had then a harbour on the Faroe Islands with which to communicate with Ireland, things like that. Although both on the Faroe Islands and we assume in Iceland, as well as Orkney and Shetland, that was a good one, Shetland and Orkney, they were both driven out by the Norsemen once they arrived. They didn't stay there for very long. And of course later on you get things like St. Brendan with his Voyages, which could be an interesting topic for a future video. Alright everyone, so thank you very much for watching. I hope you have indeed again enjoyed this History with Hilbert video about the Irish in Iceland. Now we don't know too much about them, which is a shame. As I said, that source that I showed from the Irish writer from the 6th or 7th century, that's actually the only one we really have for the Irish, apart from Íslendingabók, which is essentially where we get the information about how Iceland was colonized by the Norse, and they mention the fact that the Irish were there. But apart from that, we don't really know too much about them. But I hope you have still enjoyed this. I will soon bring out a video about the Norse settlements in North America, as well as Greenland, because there was popular request for that. I realized there was also popular request for this video to come out, which is why I've made it. So don't worry, I will have that, as well as something else related to Iceland and the Irish, which I will soon be revealing. So thanks very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up and leave a comment behind if you're interested. Don't forget to subscribe either, and I hope you will join me all again soon.